Right guys, so this video is going to be quite a specific video on something that might seem like splitting hairs at first thought, but is actually quite applied and quite relevant in terms of, programming resistance training and at least understanding what's going on when we're training. And there are many different discussions that we can have and will have in relation to cables and the redistribution of cables and how that affects the magnitude of the resistance and things like that, especially as it relates to some of the more complicated machines. But one of the things I just want you to get out of this in particular is how the cable setup itself affects the amount of inertia from the weight that you're using. So we can think of inertia very simply as the tendency for a weight that is moving to keep on moving, okay? So basically, if I begin to move this weight and I lift it, I lift it really fast like that. Once I get it going, it's easy to keep it going because it's already starting to accelerate in that upright direction, okay? So because it's accelerating upwards, it's really easy for me to just kind of swing through this just fine. And as you can see, that weight is moving through a very large range of movement. So when I begin to pull the cable down, you see there's basically a one-to-one relationship between the distance that I move the handle and the distance that the weight moves. So it basically moves with me. So that's what you can see going on there. So as a result, as I begin to move, that weight is just swinging up and down, and it's very easy for me to do that without much effort, really. Whereas, if you've got a cable set up like this, what you've got here is basically a mechanism that creates a 2-to-1 relationship. So because this cable comes down and wraps around this redirect down here, so this little circular part, because it wraps around that, what that means is that for every unit of distance that this cable moves, that's only moving half the distance. Okay, so that's only moving half of the distance, and as a result, as I begin to move that rope when I'm performing the exercise, that's not going to swing around quite as much. So I can, start to move that around loads, but there's not as much momentum or inertia generated because that's not swinging up quite as far and it's not swinging down quite as far. So as a result, if I'm doing that, I can perform that with a slightly quicker tempo without it being as easy, Whereas if I'm doing this, I need to be more mindful of the tempo that I'm using. So this is where things like tempo or repetition cadence, whatever you want to call it, where they become a little bit more important to consider. Because if you've got someone who's trying to get the most out of their triceps, let's say, and they're using an exercise like this, then they might want to actually be a bit more cognizant of moving quite slowly throughout the range of motion to minimize the effects of inertia. Because you don't want it to just be the case that weight is bouncing around, because trust me, like that feels really easy. And when I get to the bottom there, because I initiate the movement, the weight wants to keep moving and I feel like I'm doing nothing. Whereas if I move slowly, then I feel like I'm starting to do a lot more work throughout the range of motion. So basically, rule of thumb, when you've got a one-to-one relationship where this cable is coming down and inserting directly into the cable stack, there's going to be more inertia, the weight's going to want to move quicker, so you're typically going to have a presentation where someone's able to swing the weight a lot easier, and in that case, you want to use a more controlled tempo. Whereas if you're using a 2-to-1 relationship like this, where you've got a redirect down the bottom, where the cable is being redirected up this way, it's going around this rotational bit down here, then that creates a 2-to-1 relationship. So for every unit that you move the cable itself, the weight stack only moves half the distance. So as a result, there's less inertia created, and hence the weight isn't going to have the same tendency to move through space. And that means that you can move a little bit quicker without it just being a really easy exercise, So you don't, if you want to use like a 2-second up, 2-second down tempo on that, you might want to use like a 3-second down, 3-second up tempo on this. Basically, you can afford to go a bit faster on this, bit slower on this, and that's just one of the applications of something like that. So hopefully that gives you some insight into something that can seem quite theoretical and seem like it's splitting hairs, but can actually become relevant. Because if you've got a client and you see that they have a tendency to really start to swing weights around and they're not getting much out of their triceps or the biceps or whatever the machine happens to be or the cable happens to be, then this could give you some insight into why that is actually taking place and what you could potentially do to remedy it. So hopefully that gives you guys some things to think about. As I said, there's more to talk about when it comes to cables and changes in resistance, etc. But that's for a separate video. If you do have questions on this one in particular, in terms of other applications, do let us know, because it's important to note as well, I should note, This isn't just specific to these kind of pull down type cables or to tricep push down type exercises. It's also very relevant to exercises like lateral raises, for example. If you're doing a lateral raise on a one-to-one relationship like that, it's really easy to just swing the weight up, you know. Similar deal with things like cable flies. Basically the same thing again. If you're using a cable with a one-to-one relationship, be a bit more conservative with your tempo, be a bit more mindful of that kind of mind to muscle connection that you're focusing on. Whereas if you're using a 2-to-1 relationship like that, you can generally go a little bit quicker and still get a bit more work throughout the range of motion because the weight isn't running away from you. So there you go, guys. If you've got questions, let us know, or if you've got specific topic requests, so another cable exercise you'd like us to explore, just let us know and we can get that done.